This is Sunrise Sunset, the Jewish Family in Transition, and I'm Audrey Gordon. My guest today is Dr. Judith Heilizer, a clinical psychologist in private practice, and Dr. Heilizer does a lot of work with handicapped children and their families. Dr. Heilizer and I have done a show previous to this on the family's problems with the handicapped child. Today's show has to do with the handicapped child and that child's problems with himself or herself and the family and the world. Welcome, Dr. Heilizer.
It's nice to be here.
Well, let's continue in a sense because of our earlier show where we talked about the family and its emotional responses to the handicapped child. Let's talk today about the handicapped child, how they perceive the world, how that child perceives the world, the kinds of problems that child has. And I asked you before we started, what is the definition of handicap?
That's a really very difficult question to answer. When you have a child who is slightly learning disabled, he functions in the normal world and he is also part of the handicapped world. When you have a youngster who is severely retarded, he is in the same handicapped world in which the slightly learning disabled child finds himself, and yet his options are entirely different. So handicap is a matter of definition. I think perhaps the best way to think about it is that a handicapped person tends to not have available one of the many, many things that non-handicapped persons have available. But what that means is differential in terms of both the severity of the handicap and the personal adjustment of the child.
We have all the signs today for handicapped parking. We have handicapped license plates, and there is, thank God, a response now to the needs of handicapped people. But isn't there also another kind of response, a social response to the word handicapped itself? I mean, I had a father some years ago when I said, your son who's handicapped, the son had more than a slight learning disability. It was really moderate to almost severe. And he became very angry with me and said, my son is not handicapped.
I think that's a terribly important point for non-handicapped persons to remember. When there's a handicapped member in the family, in a sense, the entire family becomes handicapped. It makes a difference in the family and in their relationship to the non-handicapped world. So many times parents tend to fight the label of handicap because it then allows them to perceive themselves as not being a handicapped family. Handicap is psychological, but it is also social, and it becomes ethical and moral, and it spreads into all areas of functioning. So your father fought the idea because he chose to ally himself with the non-handicapped world because of the limitations which he perceived the handicap label would place upon himself and his family.
This is a process of denial. Does this sort of thing also go on with a handicapped child?
Yes, I think the handicapped child goes through parallel experiences in mourning as the parents do and as indeed the entire family does. I think all of the aspects of mourning are experienced by the handicapped child in whatever complexity he or she is able to experience it. Again, when we're talking about handicap, we may be talking about a slightly disabled child as compared with a multiply disabled child, and so whatever I say may or may not apply.
Isn't that one of the problems with the word handicap?
Yes, indeed it is. And
it can be the most severely retarded child, or it can be someone who really looks very normal, but has a problem.
Except for perhaps one small area of inability, can do pretty much everything other people can do.
It's like saying I have a cold.
Yes, I have a cold. That is so. The handicapped child has a major problem to work through in addition to his own mourning. The major problem has to do with separation. He is, in fact, dependent for a much longer time, or perhaps for always, on others. And separation from the nurturant environment becomes a major task for him over and above all of the developmental tasks he already has to do. So he has his normal developmental tasks. he has a separation task, and he also has his own mourning to get through. And his mourning includes the denial, which purchases time, the anger, which has to do with questions of fairness and justice.
Why did this happen to me?
When is it? Yeah, quite so. And why do all the other kids and why can't I? With anxiety, which in some situations gives the impetus to action, but in other situations may really freeze the child into inability and ineffectualness.
Anxiety that is, if I go out and play and I stumble, the other kids will laugh at me. Or if I don't catch this ball, nobody will want me on the team. That sort of anxiety?
It's not even if I don't catch the ball, it's because I will not catch the ball. I'm therefore, by definition, not able to be on the team.
Well, wait. There are a couple of components that go on in normal people, and I'm sure that they go on in handicapped children as well, because you know they're still human beings and they still have all the feelings and everything that everybody else has. If a normal person, a normal kid out on the ball field says, "I can't catch that ball," they won't. Right? I mean, it's called a self-fulfilling prophecy.
For sure.
I mean, I can't catch that ball, or I'm not good enough to be out here in left field, and therefore I shouldn't be out here in left field. Now, is it possible that a handicapped child is placed on the ball field because they really can catch the ball? Whatever's wrong with them doesn't mean they can't catch the ball, but that they're more likely to say to themselves, "I can't catch that ball," and thereby bring that prophecy true, that they'll do a number on themselves, is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I think we need to remember primarily that handicapped children are children.
Oh,
and
yes.
then they're also handicapped, so that they have all the jobs to do that non-handicapped children have to do, and then they have to deal with the limitations imposed by the handicap, which may be more or less real depending on the child's perception of himself.
When you talk about separation, we usually think about separation as taking place in adolescence for children. Are you talking about a separation earlier than that? A more primary separation? Because there's the first separation where the mother and child differentiate from each other at around age 2.
Yes, I'm talking very much about all of the separations that begin to go on from the time the baby crawls away from mom at an early age and looks over his shoulder and is able to come back and tank up again and crawl away again and tank up again till he gets up and can walk away, till he can walk away and say goodbye until he can take the car. All of those kinds of things become very different options for the handicapped child who needs to keep being tied into the parental situation for his very existence. So the separation process becomes one that needs to go on internally, which is a much more difficult job to do than if you can indeed go and do it little by little with environmental support.
So what you're saying is that if physically a child needs to rely on parents more than the normal child does, beyond the time, in other words, around 2 you're supposed to be able to feed yourself, and if at 4 you can't feed yourself, that's something that's physically being done for you that is childlike or still dependency producing. So now something has to go inside the handicapped child at an internal level that says that I need to separate emotionally even though I am physically dependent.
Quite so.
Okay,
and
that's
difficult. Oh, indeed
I mean,
it
it's
is.
very difficult for normal people to sometimes make those emotional separations, and here is someone who has real evidence that they can't do it by themselves. You know, when mom says, "Go out and play with your bike," and the kid says, "Well, I can't do it." Mom says, "Go ahead and do it."
Right.
All right, now mom can't do that with a handicapped child. How do you accomplish this sort of difficult process?
Well, before we talk about that, let me give you even a more cogent example of that, which is really exciting. There are normal phobias at 3 and 4. Phobias having to do with monsters coming out of the wall, and that you
Boogeymen
could,
in the night,
boogeymen and fires and what. Now, the handicapped child has those same phobias. The non-handicapped child says, well, what I'll do is jump out of bed and run outside and I'll be fine. The handicapped child has the same phobia and is unable to move. Is stuck within the situation without the remediating information that comes with I can, because he perceives and knows accurately that he cannot. So his task is to be able to draw from the environment and from the parental message that he can within limitations, and for other things he needs to be able to accept help while still be able to grow internally into a person who can make do with whatever he has. And it must be an excruciating task.
How do you do it?
Well, I think you do it by, first of all, an assessment procedure. I think when we speak about handicap, we tend to speak about what isn't there. But a whole other aspect of handicap is what there is, yes. And I think that we need to focus in our dealing with handicapped children and all of the many things that they can do, and in some cases where compensation takes place, can do better than those of us who have more different things
someone
available.
who's blind who might have sharpened hearing, and someone who is deaf who then reads visual cues better than we do, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. I just attended a meeting at which I sat with a man who was blind, and we were put in a group together. This was a meeting on hypnosis. And I turned to him and said, now you and I will be in the group. And he said, are you speaking to me? And I learned very, very quickly to touch him.
Yes.
And I would say to him, and then I would address him. He said to me, would you please orient me to the front of the room, because I do not choose to have my back to the speaker. He was not able to discriminate in a very, very large room where the front of the room was, because there was a lot of extraneous noise going on, and certainly before the speech started he could not localize. On the other hand, I saw him dialing his broker and placing a very complex order on the telephone by just dialing the phone. When I have to look at the numbers, when I dial the phone, I don't know where the keyboard is, the numbers on the keyboard are. He just dialed away and gave orders and put some calls and whatever he needed to do, and it came right out. So I think the process of internalization of capability has to do with focusing on what is there, rather than only focusing on what is not there.
In other words, to look at the handicapped child, we look at the child and then the handicap,
Yes.
instead of looking at the handicap and then the child.
Yes, I think so. And I think there's an additional piece. Parents have needs. And parents of handicapped children tend on the whole to have needs which involves the child's continuing dependency, meaning that the parent feels safer, more giving, more affirmed, more caring if he can prolong the child's dependency. In many cases, it has a salving, ointmental quality to the parent who is already saddled with his own pain and the pain of his child with which he empathizes.
Let's talk about what I think is a very complex dynamic that might go on between parents and their children when they're handicapped. There's pain there on the part of the parent that this child is the way it is. There's maybe guilt that they have produced a child that is defective. There may also be a wish to shield the child from society as a way of not exposing the family.
Correct. Quite
You know, I don't want the world, it will be this happy family here, or this close family, or what I call an enmeshed family very often here, and we're happy with ourselves. We'll withdraw the child from the world. We may go out, but the child will not go out with us, and it'll be a secret sort of thing. Doesn't that sort of dynamic increase the need of the parent to have the child dependent? I mean, if I let my kid go out and play on the block and my child is handicapped, then the world is going to know.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
you know, you talked about dependency as a salving effect, and I'm wondering if the parent keeping the dependency is also a protective effect for the parent.
Yes, quite so. And I think that what that tends to do is allow the parent to perpetuate the fantasy that, at least to the outside, his family
Is
could
okay.
be an okay family.
Right. Now, do we know very much about how the handicapped child perceives the world?
We know very little. Searching the literature, I found only 2 accounts by people who had been severely handicapped in their early life. But you see, we're looking at a very skewed sample. The 2 books I read were by 2 PhD handicapped people who were really not good spokesmen in the sense that they had many memories, but they also had so many of the compensatory gifts that we talked about earlier that they did not experience the full brunt because they were able to develop tremendously rich and giving lives. We don't know a whole lot, particularly because the word handicap, as we've said before, ranges from mild to tremendously and overwhelmingly severe. But we do know some things. We do know that that the mourning process in handicapped children goes on as it goes on in any situation where there's loss. There's the shattered dream. There are the comparisons, what other people do and choose to do and developmentally are ready to do but can't do. I read a very touching account of rather by a handicapped person to other handicapped adolescents. The man was now an adult, and he wrote, "Don't touch." Handicapped children tend to get touched a lot, held a lot, done to a lot.
You mean fussed over?
Well, just
can I do something for you?
Yeah, this kind of thing.
Okay.
Because it is the nature of communication for a handicapped person that you want to build this bridge. Don't touch. Make friends with your own sex first. Don't glom on.
Some handicapped children that use their handicap to get points.
And of course, getting points for your handicap isolates you further and also has the effect of not allowing you to grow. So therefore, something which was taught to you early is an adjustment pattern which you have to abandon as you grow up.
In other words, you were taught perhaps early to use other people, to use your dependency as a way of getting attention, to do that sort of thing?
Yes, and also to grow, because by definition, the handicap forces you to draw on other people in a much greater measure than you would if you could go and do things for yourself.
You know, when kids are little, normal kids are little, they learn what attention-getting devices are. I mean, if it's the temper tantrum, or I'm not going to eat my peas, or I don't want to go to bed till I have 5 drinks of water and 4 kisses, or whatever, that's normal, but kids know how to hook adults in terms of getting that attention. I have worked, not as much as you, but a little bit with handicapped children, and some of them were extremely manipulative. I mean, I remember the first time in the hospital when I had a handicapped child, the social worker said, "You can do that to the child. You can do that. Don't ask her to get that for you. You go get it." And I thought, how cruel. You know, I wasn't sensitive to this whole dynamic. Let's talk about the manipulation that's possible with the that it almost is fed to them. In other words, how do I get what I normally need, which is attention and love and goodies from mom and dad and other people, and how do I learn how to be self-sufficient when I'm not really self-sufficient? I mean, there's a manipulative thing there.
I think that's got to be one of the most difficult developmental tasks for the child to accomplish. I think the handicapped child needs everything that the non-handicapped child needs to do. Separation, individuation, limit setting. The handicapped child needs, in addition, the wise understanding as to what are growth-producing experiences and which are the experiences which are designed to shield but wind up limiting the child's potential. The handicapped child, like all other children, needs love but needs limits, needs flexibility but also needs structure. But in addition, the handicapped child needs realistic goals. It needs to be able to experience pride in smaller accomplishments. It needs all of the socialization experiences. It needs to be able to be exposed to the dangers of getting your feelings hurt. It needs to
the rough and tumble everydayness of life to learn how to handle it, just like everybody else does.
Yes, I think so. I think it needs, by virtue of its having less, it needs to do more. which is a real paradox, and which must make growing up handicapped such a very difficult chore.
So if a child has difficulty, say, with visual images or reading, I'm talking about here learning disabilities, then they have to work harder at it, but they can't be excused from it.
They can't only not be excused from it, they also, in addition to that, they must marshal resources which you and I do not need to marshal, even though they come in with less ability.
What sort of resources do you mean?
I'm talking about the ability to retain your self-esteem in the face of perpetual and continued information that you're not up to snuff. And that must be a very hard chore.
How would you know when a handicapped child should get a referral for emotional reasons rather, everybody pays attention to the physical problem. And there are handicapped children out there who are normal in an emotional way.
Yes.
Okay. How would you know when you have another problem, which is an emotional problem with a handicapped child, that you cannot ascribe to, oh, they're handicapped?
I think that is a very, very good question. I think the response here includes the word extreme. Where you see extreme depression, extreme withdrawal, extreme anger, extreme isolation, where you see children who do not only not cooperate but actually fight rehabilitation efforts, where you see bizarre behaviors that are not dictated by the handicap. And by this I mean you need to make a differential diagnosis. A child who can't hear and responds with head banging, maybe responding to the loss of the sensation of the stimulation of the hearing, that would not be bizarre behavior necessarily leading to a referral for psychiatric reasons. But where you see bizarre behavior, extreme regression, the kinds of things that you would pick up in a non-handicapped child with the word extreme attached to it, that's where you would make your psychiatric referral.
And I think it would be important to say that it is possible to help a handicapped child emotionally, even though you might not be able to right what is wrong physically.
Yes. And I think if we keep in mind that the handicapped child is a child and a person first, and then he is also handicapped, I think we'll avoid the trap of not exposing him and expecting from him all of the kinds of growth and learning that we expect from non-handicapped children. He needs to do all of that also.
Well, it sounds like the task for the parents is also doubled.
So it
Because
is.
not only do you have to be a normal mother who gets tired and irritable and whatever with her kids, you now have to know enough about what the handicapped situation is so that you can respond normally to that.
Yes, and I think part of that is permission to have your own series of deep, dark, awful feelings and give those the viability and the legitimacy and the affirmation which those deep, dark feelings require.
Could we have a quick, what happens to SIBS in the family of a handicapped child?
Yes. Siblings, along with the parents on their own and the handicapped child on their own, go through their own mourning and grieving, and that's a very complicated business. They go through fear. Is it catching when they're younger? When they're older, oh my God, what will that do to my social life? They go through anger. What if all that money that is spent? What if all of the limitations that it places on my family?
What about he gets all the attention and I bring home straight A's and, you know, he's got a cold so everybody's in the bedroom and nobody's looking at my report card?
All of that anger. There is the loneliness. A handicap in the family renders the members who are not handicapped more isolated and more lonely and stranger. There's embarrassment. It is not all that pleasant to have people turn their heads to you and your family because there's this yicky person with you whom you also happen to love and perhaps identify with and perhaps even choose to go into a profession about that helps handicapped persons, which is what happens a whole lot.
I have seen that a great deal. I have several students and whose brothers, sisters, whatever, are retarded, and they are now in health professional fields, nursing, social work, because of the influence of that family member.
A way to make good, a way to undo, a way to have meaning. But I think that the siblings of handicapped children need to have permission to act out their mourning and to get help with their mourning, because they themselves are part of the handicap, and they themselves also become handicapped in the sense that the family becomes handicapped. But there are compensations, and I think we need to think about those.
Well, you know, one of the things that we need to think about, Judith, is the fact that we could go on, and we are. That we're going to do a series now, a mini-series with all different facets about the handicapped child and family, and that this is part two, and I want to thank you for coming today, and you're going to be back. And Dr. Heilizer and I are going to do a mini-series on handicapped children themselves, having parents here, and school programs. If you are interested in this series, would you please contact the Jewish Federation, Sunrise Sunset. I am Audrey Gordon. Thank you, Dr. Heilizer. We're running out of time here. Thank you again. Goodbye.